And now what we're going to do is look at different custom number formats that we can use Excel for. And so here you see that we have the custom category selected, and in type, if I hit Alt-T, you'll notice that we have the option to type in a different format here. And if we go to Microsoft's support page for Excel, we can pull up these different number formats and we can try to identify how we might use them. So here, if you wanted to type in your own format, this is how we're going to look at these different formats in Excel. And so what we'll notice is that the values before this first semicolon are going to show up for positive numbers. The second value that you would type in between the first and the second semicolon will be for negative numbers. The value between the second and the third semicolon will be for zeros, or an amount that's equal to 0. And the value after the third semicolon will be the value or format for text. And so you'll notice here that it says if you specify only one section of format code, it will assume that the code in that section is used for all numbers. If you specify two sections of format code, the first section of code is used for positive numbers and zeros, and the second section of code will be used for negative numbers. If you want to skip, you need to make sure that you use a semicolon between each one. And so I'm going to go back to my Excel spreadsheet with that in mind. And here we still have the Format Cells dialog box open. And we'll see that there's a custom number format in here, which is actually still just the currency format from our previous example. And what we notice in here is that you'll see some number signs or some pound signs or some hashtags. And those indicate that Excel is going to put the value there if a value exists, right? So if we have the number 10, it would display it as 10. And we can use that custom format. And if we wanted to, for example, we could add a third decimal point here. And this isn't very exciting, but what we'll notice is that it's going to be similar to our currency format, just with 3 decimal points. And here you'll notice again that it formatted it as currency with just 3 decimal points. And so now I'm going to go down to the custom option, and I'm going to make a few changes. So here what I want to do is I want to display, in this case, we're going to make it 4 decimal points. So we'll add another 0. And what will happen here is that the zeros in this custom number format say that that decimal point is not optional. So if regardless of whether or not it exists, we have to at least have a 0 there, even if there's not a value. And so you'll notice with this line item for $400, even though it's exactly $400, there still exist those 4 decimal points. So those zeros tell us that that digit is going to be mandatory. It must be displayed even though it's a 0 value. There is a third option that we could use in determining these custom number formats, and we could use a question mark, but they're a little more abstract in their usage. So if we wanted to insert a question mark here, we'll notice that it's just going to be a placeholder for a digit. So maybe if we put 3 here, what you'll notice is that there's going to be 3 spaces between the $sign and the 4. And in this case, now we have 3 spaces between the $sign and the 4 for that value. And so I'm going to remove those question marks. Again, I'm not sure how functional that different format will be. And if we want to format it in a way that all of our decimal points lined up, it doesn't quite work as well either. In this case, what I've done is change the format for that one cell. And here's another feature of Excel that we could highlight, which is the Format Painter. And so you'll notice up here in the top left, if we choose Format Painter, it's going to take the format of the selection that we have, and we can use that to paint the other cells with that same format. And so again, because we have that weird format with the question marks, we'll notice that these cells or these values don't necessarily look the way that we want them to. What it does do is line them up at the decimal point, and maybe that's convenient, But in values where the digits don't exist, we're not going to see them there. So for 400, this looks very odd, right? We would want to make sure that we displayed those decimal points. So we're going to use some combination of number signs and zeros. And so now I've formatted back to general just so we can get an idea and a fresh start here. And so what I want to do, again, just so we kind of understand what's going on here, is I want to say, I want this to display 3 decimal points, and I'm going to give it a value or a format for a negative number. Again, we'll remember that if we have 2 formats, they need to be separated by a semicolon, and the first one will take the value of positive numbers and zeros, and the second one will take the value of negative numbers. And so here we'll see for negative values, we'll have parentheses, and the dollar sign will show up inside of the parentheses. It'll have 3 decimal points, and the other numbers beyond that first 0 to the left of the decimal point are optional. And so we see that format here. If I wanted to go back in and change that to where the dollar sign is on the outside of the parentheses for negative numbers, I could. And all I would have to do is put the dollar sign to the left of that left parenthesis in order to do that. And you'll notice that it updated our format. And that might be helpful. And you'll notice that in this case, though, we see some differences in these values. You'll notice that this negative value and this positive value are off as far as aligning the decimal point. So we're going to try to align the decimal point for these values. And what we need to do is have Excel believe that there's going to be the space for a right parenthesis on positive values as well. And so we need to use this custom number formatting in order to do that. And what I'm going to do after I hit Control 1 and then tab over to type so I can edit this format, I'm going to insert an underscore, right? So hold down the Shift key and then insert an underscore. And then I'm going to put a right parenthesis just to the right of that underscore. And what that does is tell Excel it wants a space equal to a right parenthesis on each positive value. And now we notice that those negative values and those positive values line up. So if you want to separate yourself from your coworkers, one way to do that is to make sure that your Excel spreadsheets look great. And in this case, you can align them at the decimal point in order to set yourself apart. And so now we've seen what we can do with aligning these decimal points and including a certain number of decimal points and making them mandatory, and also adjusting the location of that dollar sign. And now we're going to format the 0 value to a little bit different format. So here again, I held down Control 1 and I'm going to tab over to our type so we can edit this formula. I'm going to put another semicolon here. And now what I want to do is just have Excel display the words no value. So I'm going to type in the words no value and let's see what happens. I'm going to get an error message, right? And this error message tells us that we cannot use the number format that we typed, and it suggests that we try one of the built-in number formats. And that's not going to work for us. We do want that no value to display, so here's what we need to do. Many times when we work with text in Excel, we need to use quotation marks. And so I'm going to use quotation marks around those words. And for most of the values, nothing will happen. But for the value that has 0 in it, you can watch the change when we hit enter. And so here you see that it displays the words no value. But what we'll notice is that this value still actually has a 0 in it. So if we look in our formula bar, you'll notice that the value there is still 0. Right? So if I wanted to replace that here, I could type in a 0. And what will happen is it will display the words no value. And so if we wanted to edit that for negative values, we could. And now what you'll see is if we hit enter, you'll notice that the format will save it as less than 0, even though the value will still be in that cell. So here we see this cell is still negative 148, but the value that's in the cell or what's displayed says less than 0. And the same for cell G9. And so there could be a case where you could use that if you wanted to draw attention to that to a supervisor. If some value being negative or 0, it could be a way for you to highlight those differences. And now that I've changed those negative values back to what they were, we can also work with colors in Excel. And so what we could do here is make this value a certain color. And when we want to do that, we need to use a square bracket. And so the color that we want the text to be has to be at the beginning, again with square brackets around it. And you'll notice that all the positive values are going to be blue. If we want to change the negative values to green, we could. And you'll see the negative values are now green, and if we wanted to change the zeros, we could as well. And so we can change these different colors to represent positive, negative, or 0 values. The next thing we could look at is that if for some reason this wasn't a dollar value, and instead were a multiple of some kind, right? So if I were to put some different values in column I here. And so when column I, maybe we'll think about a price to earnings ratio. And so, for example, if we have a stock that has a price of $25 with $2.50 in earnings, we would get a PE ratio of 10. And here we have those values here. If we wanted to indicate to the person who was working with this spreadsheet that that PE ratio is times, so we would know that our price is 10 times our earnings, we could change the format of that cell. And so I just hit Control 1 and then tabbed to get to the custom number format. And I can insert words here. So for a positive value, again, we're dealing with a PE ratio, so we don't need this to be in dollars. But if I wanted the user of the spreadsheet to know that this was times, I could insert the word times here. One other thing that you'll see is that as we're changing these formats, you'll see a sample of what is currently in that cell above where we're typing that value in. So here we can see that it's going to display as 10.000 times. And so if I wanted to have the price and the earnings match up with our PE ratio, I could. I'm going to hit Control 1 to get to our Format Cells dialog box, and then I'll hit Tab. And so what I want to have here is the number and 3 decimal points, and then enough space for 1 space after, and then also the word times. And so in order to have enough space here, I need to use the underscore. And for the first one, I'm simply going to leave an underscore and then press the space bar. And after that, I'm going to use an underscore for each letter of the word. And so what this tells Excel is that it's going to have 3 decimal points. It will always have a 0 to the left of the decimal point. Anytime there are extra numbers beyond that, we will show them. And then it will have enough space for the word times at the end. And here you'll notice that those cells line up perfectly. And so the last thing that we'll look at is just a couple of shortcuts that we can use in Excel, and they also work in other Microsoft applications. If I want to bold something, I can just activate the cell and hold down Control and hit the letter B for bold. If I want to italicize something, I can hold down Control and hit the letter I for italicize. And if I want to underline something, I can simply hold down Control and hit U to underline. And now you have a few tools to make sure that the format in your worksheets will set your work apart from your peers.